Good morning, students. I am Dr. Vijay Bhandari, Associate Professor in SIRTS CSC Department. So now, let's start with the architecture of DBMS today. So here is the outline. First, I will cover architecture of DBMS, types of DBMS architecture, and at last, I will cover advantages of DBMS systems. Then I will conclude my lecture, right? And if any query, so we will discuss. Now, the architecture of DBMS. So, as we have learned some basics of the DBMS in last lectures. So here, why do we need the architecture of DBMS? I will explain you. So database management systems architecture will help us understand the components of database systems and the relation among them, right? So the architecture of DBMS depends on the computer systems on which it runs, right? Hope so you are understanding these terms. And for example, we can see here in client server DBMS architecture. The database systems at the server machine can run several requests made by client machines. Now we will understand this communication with this help of diagram, right? So here we will see the diagram and discuss the types of DBMS architecture. So there is the logical DBMS architecture, three-level architecture of DBMS, as we can see here in this diagram. The external level or V level, this is the top view level, and the conceptual level or global level, and the internal or physical level, right? So here we will understand the types of the DBMS architecture. So single tier architecture, in this type of the architecture, the database readily available on the client machine. If we talk about the two-tier architecture, in two-tier architecture, the database system is present at the server machine and the DBMS. So here we will talk about the single tier architecture. In this type of architecture, the database is readily available on the client machine, and any request made by the client does not require a network connection to perform the action on the database. For example, we want to fetch the records of the employee from the database, and the database is available on our computer systems. So the request to fetch employee details will be done by your computer, and the records will be fetched from the database by your computer as well. So sometimes this type of system is generally referred as a local database system also. Now we will discuss the two-tier architectures. In two-tiered architecture, the database system is present at the server machine, and the DBMS application is present at the client machine. So these two machines are connected with each other through a reliable network as shown in this figure, right? So it is a client server architecture, direct communications, run faster, tightly coupled. So these are the characteristics of the two-tier architecture diagram. Okay, so database system is always present at the server machine and the DBMS, right? If we take an example, whenever client machine makes a request to access the database present at the server using a query language like SQL, and the server performs the request on the database and returns the results back to the client. So these applications connections interface such as JDBC, ODBC are used for the interactions between server and client, right? So I request to please prefer the video of JDBC, ODBC, and application connections, right? So there you might be understanding all these things, right? Now we will talk about the three-tier architectures. Three-tier architectures. This is the another layer between the client machine and server machines. In this architecture, the client application does not communicate directly with the database systems present at the server machines. Rather, the client applications communicates with server applications. And the server applications internally communicates with the database systems present at the server, right? So this is the diagram of three-tier architecture. You can see here, and how it works, right? So in this layer you can see uh, it layers the present between the client machine and server machines, right? So you can see database user and client DBMS applications is connected by the network connection to the server DBMS application and database systems, right? So in this architecture, the client application does not communicate directly with the database system, right? And that is the present at the server machine, and rather the client applications communicates with server application, and the server application internally communicates with the database systems present at the server. You can see here in this diagram. So you might be understanding all these things. If any doubts, so please ask me, right? So is that clear to all? Okay, so we move on the next slide. There is a difference between the two tier and three tier architecture. So you can see here difference between two-tier architecture and three-tier architecture, right? So here in this diagram, two-tier database architecture and three-tier database architecture. So I will explain you some differences. If we talk about the two-tier database architecture, it is a client-server architecture, and two-tier the applications logic is either buried inside the user interface on the client or within the database on the server. Whereas the three-tier database architecture, we can see here in this diagram, it is a web-based application in three-tier architecture, and the application logic or process resides in the middle tier. It is separated from the data in a user interface, right? Whereas two-tier architecture consisting two layers, client tier and database. Whereas three-tier architecture consisting three layers, client layers and business layers and the data layers, as we can see in this diagram. In two-tier architecture, it is very easy to build and maintain, but in three-tier, it is very complex to build and maintain, right? Whereas that two-tier architecture runs slower and it is less secured, as a client can communicate with the database directly. But in three-tier architecture runs faster and it is secured, as a client is not allowed to communicate with database directly, as we can see in this figure. In two-tier architecture, it results in the performance loss whenever the user increases rapidly, but it, in three-tier architecture, it results in performance loss whenever the system is run on the internet but gives more performance than two-tier architectures. We can take an example like designing registration form which contains text box, labels, buttons, or a large website on the internet, like any marketing website like Amazon, Flipkart, right? But in two-tier architecture, we can take an example like contact management system created using MS Access or railway reservation systems, right? So client can access the database directly. So these are all about the architectures of DBMS, differences between two-tier and three-tier. So I hope so you might be understanding all these topics. Thank you. If any doubts, so please ask me. Thank you.